So we are very pleased to welcome you to this press conference today. This is a rare and extreme pleasure for the Missouri Botanical Garden and for Botanic Gardens Conservation International. The work that has been going on here this week is of great import to the globe, and we feel very honored at the Missouri Botanical Garden and to St. Louis to have been able to host this. The findings that come from this conference will be presented to the United Nations later this month, later in October, and it is of critical importance that these findings be accepted. It is of critical importance to each of us, to our children, to our grandchildren, and to the future of the planet. We are extremely pleased to have this very august panel who will be addressing you today, explaining to you what they have found, what they will present, and the importance of those findings. And with that, I would like now to turn it all over for opening remarks to Her Royal Highness, Princess Basma. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome you all today here, and I thank you for coming today to this very important meeting that we've had from yesterday, half of which you've all participated in. And I think it's very prominent to say that we're very lucky to be hosted by the Missouri Botanical Garden, and it's very appropriate since it's one of the top botanical gardens in the world with a huge history, a long history of working in conservation, not only in St. Louis, Missouri, but across the globe, and to gather a very rich and diverse pool of experts that are sitting here with me today in the room. And it's really a privilege to be able to contribute to the global efforts of plant conservation at this very prominent time that we're living in, where we're on the cusp of the global change from an era of things were going quite well and now not so well, but it's in your hands to make that change. It is through your expertise, your knowledge, and your cumulative knowledge of all of us to be able to contribute. And it's no small feat. In the last 2 days, yesterday and today, the efforts that we're going to do, we hope will be adopted at the United Nations. So I would like to remind everyone that every word we put in there will affect our children and our grandchildren, and that's the legacy that we're going to leave behind. So with this, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I will hand over to Professor Stephen Blackmore for introductions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Royal Highness, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I have the great personal honour of chairing Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which exists as the world's largest network for the conservation of plants. And it functions really by bringing people together and convening meetings of this kind and developing the important agenda that we have been discussing at our meetings and going forward. And as Her Royal Highness has just said, we've been meeting really at a critical point in time in human history, where finally, I think, we are understanding how plants function in the base of all life on Earth and sustaining us, our food systems, the air we breathe, the water flowing through the rivers. Everything about this planet is dependent on plants. And botanic gardens in recent years have been stepping up to say, well, we are the people who know how to grow the plants and to restore and to maintain a planet suitable for human life. So we have, in our community, taken on that huge challenge. And we've had an exciting meeting. I mean, just to emphasize that we've come together from around the world here today. So sitting in the audience and much better able to answer than me on many questions, we have people from Malawi in Africa, from Haiti, from China, from South Africa, from the United States and the United Kingdom, and of course from Jordan. And so we really are able to bring together, and France, sorry, looking up and noticing I'm forgetting, we really are bringing together people from around the world to focus on some of those biggest challenges and what we can see as the plant part, the botanical part of the solution. So our meeting's very much focused on how plants can be used in creating the desirable future that we want to have. And I'd just like to close really by saying for now that Missouri Botanical Garden is absolutely the right place to host this gathering. This is an amazing institution, and I think all botanic gardens around the world, and I speak from having been the director of the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh in the past, all botanic gardens in the world see the leadership that's coming from this place in so many areas of science and conservation and botanic garden practice. So we have come to the right place to consider these challenges and have had an exciting and productive time. I hope we'll have a lively discussion afterwards of what we've been doing, but I'm handing over now to Paul Smith, who is the Secretary General of Botanic Gardens Conservation International. Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here as well on behalf of BGCI. Botanic Gardens Conservation International is an organization that represents the world's 3,000 botanic gardens. And over the last 20 years, we have collectively, as a community, been instrumental in delivering the global strategy for plant conservation. And that has evolved through various iterations. And one of the reasons we're here this week is to look at the emerging global biodiversity framework that came out of COP15 last year and see how the global strategy can fit into that framework. And I think one of the great things about the global strategy for plant conservation has been that it's always been target focused. And for that reason, it's arguably the most successful element of the biodiversity framework. We, as a community, we grow a wider range of plant diversity than any other professional community. Over 120,000 different plant species, 18,000 tree species. We have a tremendous amount to contribute here. And one of the really encouraging things for me coming out of the new global biodiversity framework is that at last the world seems to recognize that we need to be recovering and restoring biodiversity and the landscapes that we have disrupted. And that's right up our street. That is exactly what botanic gardens do. And the recommendations that will come out of this week is that we continue to play a leadership role, we get stuck in, and we throw all the resources at our disposal at preventing the loss of biodiversity. So it's exciting for us, it's timely, and I think we have an enormous role to play. Thank you. Peter.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to give you a little bit more background as well to what Paul and Her Royal Highness and Steve have said about the importance of this meeting. We are in an extremely exciting and important time for botanic gardens and plant conservation. We know that there are tens of thousands of plant species throughout the world that are in danger of extinction and that their habitats are being lost for a multitude of different reasons. But what is exciting is the fact that we're on the cusp of a new era for plant conservation, where the United Nations, through the Convention on Biological Diversity, is considering its new global strategy for plant conservation to connect with the global biodiversity framework. And botanic gardens are very much committed to this strategy. And this meeting here this week with experts from botanic gardens around the world will really focus our efforts on finding priorities. What are the priorities that botanic gardens can do to achieve plant conservation and to assist the 196 countries that are currently considering implementing and adopting that global strategy for plant conservation. It will be considered at a meeting in a United Nations meeting in Nairobi in October, and it's expected that they will recommend the strategy's adoption. But we want to make a strong statement at this meeting that the botanic gardens of the world are here and ready to play their part in achieving the objectives of that strategy, and that we will be relied on in every country where there are botanic gardens to be delivering many of the important actions to achieve that. And it's a diverse and extraordinarily complex tale to tell about what botanic gardens can do in plant conservation, from the basic recovery of endangered species to recreating and supporting the establishment or restoration of whole ecosystems, from understanding the impacts of climate change on plant diversity and then working to mitigate it, from achieving sustainable use of the plants on which we all rely, and perhaps finally understanding plants better through our research work and communicating through the billion people who visit botanic gardens each year around the world, communicating the importance of plants, and that it is a responsibility of all of us, whether we are botanists in botanic gardens or gardeners or all the public, to protect plants now and for the future.
So I think, shall we open for Q&A?
I think we can open for any. Yes, Alicia Russell, who is the St. Louis Citywide Sustainability Director, has a proclamation to deliver from the city of St. Louis.
And then we'll open for questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here at this kickoff to the International Leaders Committed to Action Supporting the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. Mayor Jones sends her regrets that she couldn't be here with you all today, but she sent me. My name's Alicia Russell. I'm the City of St. Louis's Sustainability Director. So on behalf of the city, we'd like to thank the Missouri Botanical Garden for hosting this event, for all of you traveling so far to be here with us today and enjoy St. Louis City while you're here. And so we would like to appreciate your dedication to the global strategy for plant conservation and diversity as we face so many challenges with the climate today. And I'd like to proclaim today, September 29th, 2023, as Global Strategy for Plant Conservation at the Missouri Botanical Garden Day in the city of St. Louis.
Thank you all. I think we can now be open for any questions that you have. And please do give your name and where you're coming from in your question if you're comfortable to do so. I'm glad we've been so comprehensive in our explanations that we have you stunned into silence, but please feel free to.
Maybe I will ask a question.
Good idea.
Dr. Peter, and I would like to ask you, when you first started working on the GSPC, and please remind us when that was, and what did you have in mind? How did you see the GSPC then? How would it unfold to what it is today? Has it been what you had expected it to be? And by 2030, what do you expect in the future?
Oh my goodness.
Sorry. Put you on the spot.
In 1999, the International Botanical Congress was held in St. Louis, and one of the outcomes of that Congress was a resolution calling for the international community to make plant conservation a new priority, because recognizing the loss of plant species worldwide and the urgency of it. And that was nearly 25 years ago. And the outcome of that was a group of botanists who got together, including my colleague Steve Blackmore and I, and we got together in the Canary Islands and said, how do we take this forward? And the decision was made to present it to the United Nations through the Convention on Biological Diversity to propose to have a global strategy for plant conservation. The negotiations with that continued, and in 2002, the UN, through the convention, adopted the first global strategy for plant conservation. And that had 16 targets to be achieved by 2010. Some of them were, others weren't. It was renewed in 2011 up to 2020. And so we're entering the third phase of the global strategy for plant conservation. But what has been remarkable about the strategy is that botanic gardens have been at the heart of achieving its targets. In many cases, we can look at the targets and say, well, they weren't all implemented, they weren't all achieved. And indeed, very few of them were 100% achieved. But I think there is no doubt that without the framework provided by the global strategy, not half the progress that has been made would have been made. Now, what we have to do with the new phase of the global strategy for plant conservation, which is now understood and clear what are the priorities in the work going forward, we have to move forward and say with renewed vigor, renewed enthusiasm and renewed determination, not just in botanic gardens, but also to support countries around the world to actually achieve their commitments to it and to link it to the broader global biodiversity framework that the convention adopted in December of last year. So exciting times, but a real challenge and a real responsibility for us to move forward and build on what has already been achieved.
Maybe I could add to that, having seen that process from the beginning, as you say, Peter, a couple of points I would make was that, in fact, it was the Botanic Garden community taking the initiative, not asked by anybody else to do it, but just stepping forward because people in botanical gardens see the challenges around the world and we're all too aware of the kinds of issues we needed to tackle. And we all see climate change impacting our lives around the world. But also, just to give you an idea of some of the things that were needed 25 years ago and that have been done. The first target was to have a widely accessible list of the Earth's plant species. And many people would imagine that we already had that organized, but it did not exist. It's not a trivial task to do it, but again, thanks to leadership from Missouri Botanical Garden and a number of other gardens around the world, there is now a World Flora Online, which is that comprehensive list of the plants that was needed. But the other big missing gap in our knowledge was, well, which are the ones that are threatened, which are the ones that are doing okay? And that has been an area where BGCI has been working particularly hard, starting with the trees, some of the most important plants on Earth, to have a complete assessment of the status of trees. And that follows the red listing process that has been used for endangered species, but in fact has been completed in record time. It's been the biggest and fastest assessment of threats to species ever achieved in human history. What that tells us is we now know which plants are threatened, we can go into action and start saving them. And it has provided that kind of focus. So as we go forward into the new phase of the strategy, we're building now on some much firmer foundations than existed 25 years ago. And I think that's been a remarkable achievement.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Well, I have another one for Paul. And I would like to ask you, if you could have a wish list of what you would need to be able to achieve as director of the BGCI, what would it be? That's the first part of the question. And the second part, what would you like botanic gardens across the world to do and focus on to help you achieve your aim?
Thank you. I think I might take the second question first, because that leads to the other question. I think for botanic gardens, we have, in some cases for hundreds of years, including in this institution, described plant diversity. Steve talked about the World Flora Online. We now have an inventory of plant diversity across the world. We also have information on which species are most threatened. And when you think about the process around conserving and managing plant diversity sustainably, you need to know those things. You need to know what they are, what they're called, you need to know where they are, and you need to know which ones need prioritization. But for me, the big challenge for botanic gardens now is doing the next stuff. And that's about using all of our knowledge across science, horticulture, education, to work with broader society to better conserve and manage plant diversity in the landscape. And that means not just in our landscapes, it means working with society at huge scale. We have that knowledge, but we are a relatively small community, and we cannot wait for the world to come to us. We need to be out there and working with the rest of the world, sharing our skills, our data, and our knowledge. I think a few years ago, I put a challenge to Botanic Garden Science, and my question was, if the research that you're doing doesn't help us to better conserve or manage plant diversity in the landscape, why are you doing it? This is what we're for. And describing plant diversity is a means to the end. We now need to get to the end. And that's a cultural shift, I think, for many gardens that have focused on the science and the description. So that's the biggest challenge. How to make it happen? Well, I think meetings like this, I think leadership. We have around the table here and in this room directors from 35 gardens from all the continents. And it's really important that we set that agenda for the wider community. There are more practical constraints like funding and the need to put a lot more funding and money into this, but that is a societal problem. It's not just our problem. And so the thing that I would most like to see is the world at large and our leaders, our political leaders, taking biodiversity seriously, because we can't be living without it.
Thank you very much for that. And with this, I would like to turn the questions to our audience, our very, very highly esteemed experts, and see, would you like to add anything to this and a message to St. Louis and to the world? Please do speak up. And what would you like to have and get from BGCI or the CBD, any messages you would like to get across? I open the floor to you. Don't be shy. Thank you. Can we have would you like to take this?
Thanks, Carly.
Thank you. I'm Murphy Westwood, the Vice President of Science and Conservation from the Morton Arboretum outside of Chicago, Illinois. I was wondering if you could comment a little more on how maybe members of the general public could participate in or learn more about or engage in the type of work that Botanic Gardens are doing for plant conservation.
Paul.
Yeah. Thank you, Murphy. Well, I think the first thing to say is that it is not possible to carry out plant conservation, recovery, restoration without the involvement of local communities and the people who are actually managing that plant diversity. And I would say all of our programs, and I think I would speak for most botanic gardens now, understand that. This is not a top-down process. It's a process that needs to be, for want of a better word, co-created, co-owned. And that involvement of local communities is absolutely essential. But that's a multidisciplinary approach as well. And I think this is not something that one community can do on its own. We can bring some things to it, but local communities can bring other things like traditional knowledge about what those plants are used for, and it needs to be together. Nobody has all of the answers. I think if we can get that across, and there are many projects that do that superbly. We have a number of African delegates here, and what we're seeing, for example, in Africa with new kinds of botanic gardens, I'm thinking of Toru Botanical Garden, for example, in Uganda, is these are hubs for growing a wider range of native species that provide benefits for local communities. So they are species that have always been used, but usually just taken from the wild, never cultivated, never managed. By combining the skills of Toru Botanical Garden and their nursery men and their horticulturists and so on with that local knowledge, and then training others, suddenly your farmer can cultivate a much wider range of species for multiple benefits. And I think that new kind of garden, if you like, which is plugged into the big challenges, climate change, poverty, loss of biodiversity, is the kind of evolution that we need to be making as a professional community that will be all-inclusive and actually will serve society rather than telling society what to do. There's a big difference there.
My other question is, and this is open to anyone who would like to answer, is what message would you like to get out to those who collect or purchase plants that are collected from the wild in an unsustainable way and actually have contributed to the detriment of these collections and caused extinction? Can anyone answer me?
I can't provide a complete answer, but one of the things I can just to report back is to say that we have seen in presentations and in our discussions from a number of countries, but in particular the case in Mexico and in South Africa, where succulent plants, amongst others, are being taken from the wild by people who wish to have them in their own personal collections and gardens. And we heard, really quite shockingly, that in the past few years, many species have gone extinct in South Africa precisely because they've been removed. And I believe the same has happened in Mexico too. So we need to make sure that the people who are buying plants, I'm quite certain none of them intended that to be the consequence of them getting a plant they wanted to enjoy and appreciate the beauty of it. But that is what's happening. And so we need to provide the information that allows people buying plants for their own gardens, for their homes, to be aware of those that have been produced responsibly and should be available for sale, in contrast to those that have basically been plundered from the natural environment. And this is urgent. The scale in which it's happening was a complete shock and surprise to me, because it's happened for a long time, but in recent years, this has really become a serious problem. We hear all the time about, for example, in Africa, poaching for ivory, elsewhere in the world, tigers, animals that are under pressure. But I think very few people realize that plants are threatened in the same way, and possibly a far greater number of plant species are threatened in that way.
Thank you. Which brings me on to the other question. I would go back to Paul and anyone else who would like to answer, but the global biodiversity standards, how do you see that as a mechanism or a tool that can help the efforts of plant conservation?
So the Global Biodiversity Standard, for those who are not familiar with it, and I'm assuming most people in the room will be because we talked about it at length yesterday, is a methodology which is being developed by the Botanical Garden community to assess the impacts largely of tree planting for carbon sequestration on biodiversity. And there is a big danger, which we are already seeing, that we are putting huge numbers of trees into the landscape, usually exotic species and usually monocultures, so just single species, and displacing biodiversity. This is ironic, given that a third of tree species are actually threatened with extinction. Ideally, we would be combining the two and bringing threatened tree species into these tree planting programs. But usually what you'll see pine and eucalyptus and so on as monocultures. So the Global Biodiversity Standard is set up with a methodology that assesses that impact on biodiversity. If people are planting trees, are they inadvertently displacing biodiversity? If they are, then how can we help them to get better biodiversity outcomes? And so there's a strong mentoring component as well, because as I mentioned earlier, we grow such a wide range of plant diversity. We have the knowledge and skills to enable people who want to sequester carbon, or they want to develop livelihoods opportunities by planting plants and trees, to diversify that portfolio of species which is planted, and do a big favor for biodiversity. I want to say just one other thing. I mean, one of the great things about plants is, of course, that they sit at the base of the trophic pyramid, as we say, so the rest of biodiversity relies on plants. If you plant an oak tree, I'm talking about an English oak here for the moment, but it could be a white oak, could be any kind of oak. You're supporting thousands of other organisms that are a part of the life cycle. The oak is part of their life cycle: insects, birds, mammals, fungi, lichens, and so on. If you plant an exotic eucalyptus, you're creating a sterile landscape. So the knock-ons for biodiversity are enormous, and we need to be shifting away from this paradigm of just planting fast-growing, carbon-sequestering exotic species to something which is much more diverse, much more resilient, and much better for biodiversity. And that's, I think, how this mechanism can help.
Thank you very much. And I think that's it for now.
There's a question. There's
yes.
two questions there. He has the microphone behind you. Oh. Have the microphone.
Thank you, everybody. What I'm asking is, now we have so much information from Botanic Gardens, as you have, Paul has rightly indicated it. But how do we really use this information that's available to influence national focal points on CBD, and then they take it higher up to the international level? So how do we really connect it? Because different countries have different ways of dealing. Some botanical gardens are actively working with national focal points, others don't. But in order to really make a clear impact, we really need to have that connection, and that would really lead us to the discussion that we'll have later. Thank you.
Perhaps I could make an effort to answer that. There is a wonderful network of national focal points for the Biodiversity Convention in every country, and there are specific national focal points relating to the global strategy for plant conservation too. And I think that each one of the Botanic Gardens and ourselves can make connections, strong connections, and build a relationship with those national focal points. Not only for cooperation, but to actually outline how we can bring knowledge and action through Botanic Gardens and through the plant conservation community to assist governments in meeting their obligations under the Global Biodiversity Framework and in plant conservation. And I think it's up to individual institutions throughout the world to build on the existence of those focal points to ensure that there are genuine partnerships made. Because many countries will report on plant conservation actions, but they forget that a lot of the important work is going on in the non-governmental sector as well, including Botanic Gardens.
I would like to add to that our example in Jordan. So what we have is we have a National Biodiversity Committee, which is specifically related to the CBD, and its members are some of the governmental institutions and NGOs who work in the conservation to actually actualize the convention's targets. And this is where we meet on monthly basis. and discuss these important issues. One of which was the biodiversity, the global biodiversity framework, and each target. So I think it's important that the botanic gardens who work in this field get onto the committee like we have, and really study the convention, and then bring that up to the focal point and have him, when he's out, or her, in the meetings, to follow up really meticulously on the proceedings. One issue that we were particularly interested in was the DSI, for the biodiversity framework. So that's one mechanism that you can do and use. Otherwise, as Dr. Peter said, fostering the relationship between the institution, the NGO or botanic garden, and the focal point. And really, it's all about the human networking. And this is where true impact can happen, fostering and not making it all just on paper, but developing those relationships. I don't know if anyone would like to add anything.
Zachariah Magombo from Malawi. Perhaps my question relates to the previous one, but in a different way. We're talking of 3,000 botanical gardens plus in the world. And these gardens are at different stages of development and progress. I mean, if you look at Missouri Botanical Garden, it's one of the outstanding gardens. And yet, on the other hand, we have new ones that are just emerging, and we all want these to also have a role to play. And I want to believe there are best practices that you find in these different gardens. My question is, BGCI, do you see a role that you can play to facilitate sharing of knowledge, experiences, and best practices that you find in these different gardens, so that we build that critical mass to scale up the conservation efforts? Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, the short answer is yes, of course. And, we already have some great examples of that in terms of a lot of work has gone into, I mentioned species recovery over, a minute ago, into how we do that. There's a lot of knowledge which has been gathered around the world, and the principles are the same no matter where you are. So we have a species recovery manual, for example, which was developed a few years ago, that tells you everything that you need to know about the basics of plant species recovery. But we also have, coming out of that, briefs or training documentation in multiple languages, which is there really accessible to kind of all levels of development. So, it's not just for scientists in an institution like this. It's actually for working with communities on the ground to understand those principles and to share those principles. And that's why I think it's essential that we work together on this, so that we don't reinvent the wheel, so that we don't duplicate effort. We can't afford to be doing that. And as you will have picked up, one of the main purposes of this meeting, and we have this every year, is to work out ways, mechanisms, vehicles by which all gardens can work to support each other. And each garden will have its own strength, as your gardens do, that will complement others. And if we can make that work in a synergistic way, then I think we will be greater than the sum of our parts. And that's really what BGCI aims to do. Our mission is to mobilize botanical expertise for people and for plants. And that means all of that botanical expertise, all of those people and all of those plants. The only way we're going to do that is by working together.
And maybe I could add one very specific mechanism that works extremely well, and I've seen many examples around the world, is when you have a kind of twinning agreement or partnership between gardens who have an abundance of resources and those in countries where there are fewer resources and the garden is probably in need of help and assistance and advice. But working together and exchanging of staff, really shares experiences and understanding in a great way. And there's some excellent examples of that. And for any gardens who are not yet partnering in that way with countries around the world, I strongly recommend it. It's very satisfying to do it, and it's one of the ways of addressing that issue that you raised in connection with Malawi.
Missouri Botanical Garden is one of those, and I want to just pay tribute to the work that MBG has been doing in Madagascar for decades now. 200 Malagasy staff, 13 protected areas, and working closely with the Botanic Gardens, with Ansakai, with Tsimbazaz and other gardens in Madagascar in a partnership, a true partnership, not a project coming in and out, but actually a long-term investment of sharing knowledge, expertise, and data.
And the last thing, I just want to remind everyone that in BGCI's US board meeting, they all mentioned, the American US Botanic Gardens mentioned they would like to increase their global collaboration. So I encourage all those out of the US to contact the US Botanic Gardens and initiate that collaboration, and vice versa. Microphone.
Shut down in a moment.
Yes. Last 3 questions or 2 questions. Go ahead. Sorry.
Good morning. Christopher Willis. I'm from the South African National Biodiversity Institute in South Africa. Just to follow up on my colleague here from Africa, just around the role of BGCI in expanding the botanic gardens globally. We know we've already expanded from 700 odd to 3,000 over several decades. But I think there are still countries without botanical gardens in the globe. So just thoughts on how we can maybe ideally get a botanical garden. Every country should at least have one botanical garden, play its role in conservation education, community engagement, research. Just maybe some thoughts from the panel members on that. Thank you.
May I? One of the things that botanic gardens do really well is growing plants. But one of the things they also do remarkably is growing leaders. And all of the new botanic gardens that have been created around the world, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, over the last couple of decades. It has been because of individual leaders who have a dream, who have a sense of responsibility. And I think we need to be positioned in the botanic garden community to give them the support they need to grow those. And finding potential leaders in countries where there are no botanic gardens, and there are still a few, will be an important task to do.
Just to add to that, I mean, we now have resources from that. We have the Botanic Garden Manual, which tells you everything you need to do to establish a botanic garden and manage it. We have training courses now which are pitched at a much more accessible level. That manual is, it has everything in it. But I think that work needs to continue. But I think also at the political level, I think a botanic garden in the world we live in today is an essential. It's not a nice to have. It is about how we better manage and conserve plant diversity.
Shall we take 2 more questions? They were from this side. Matthew, can we give the microphone?
I'm Maite Delmas from the National Natural History Museum in Paris. And we have a huge challenge ahead of us, we all know, to conserve plants for the future generation and meeting people's needs currently. How, as institution, can we make sure that we engage every single person? We all have a part to play, and how can we best engage each person that visits our botanic gardens? I think there is a lot of thinking that we need to put into that through maybe better communication but this would be my message, and I think the proclamation of today is going to be something that will make a difference.
I can have a go at that. maybe different communication. We're pretty good at communicating. We have the estimates seem to vary, between 750 million and 1 billion visitors a year come to botanic gardens. So we have exposure to a wide range of society. We know that people come to botanic gardens mainly for the peace and quiet, for relaxation, to be with their family. All the questionnaires tell us that. So they don't come to be preached to. But I do think that we need to be clearer around our communications and messaging around not just the challenges that we face, but the opportunities that we have to fix them, and what botanic gardens are doing in that respect. And I personally, I think all of us in this room are optimists. And we're also in a privileged position in that we can be doing something positive about adaptation to climate change, loss of biodiversity, all of those things. We are doing positive things. But I think we need to communicate that to our members and visitors, and also involve them. So this is how you can get involved in this, whether it's in your backyard or whether it's joining a community group or whatever. So less around the ornamental horticulture perhaps, and more around what we're doing to solve problems.
Thank you, Paul. And the last question.
Good morning, Mauricio. My name is Mauricio Diaz-Granados, Head of Science of the New York Botanical Garden. And I have a question for the table, and it is, considering the environmental crisis and the important roles of botanical gardens and the urbanization trend of the world, should all the cities have botanical gardens, as they plan to have hospitals, schools, universities? Why not all the cities should have at least a botanical garden?
I might say that there are countries that are adopting that approach. For example, I know in China, there is a system now of national botanic gardens recognized by the government, but there are 200 or more gardens in China, and cities feel the importance of a garden as part of their own development and the civic pride. And we see that around the world. My feeling is that they then have a unique opportunity to influence what the landscape of their particular city looks like, to make not just the garden, but the city and the wider environment green and a more livable environment for people to live in. And I think that whether every city has its own garden or not, what I hope might happen is that gardens will come out more into their wider communities in the countries they're based in, and seek to influence what that country actually looks like, what it feels like to live in it. So there's a huge role in influencing the development of urban landscapes as people move more and more into cities. They need that botanic garden expertise to help in the design of cities for the future. Even if there is no botanic garden on hand, the most important thing then is how would the city look, and how would it reflect the expertise that can come from botanic gardens and the better use of plants in the built environment.
May I just add to all of the things that Steve has said on this, which I agree with thoroughly. It is very notable that one of the actions in the new global strategy for plant conservation relates to actually strengthening and establishing botanic gardens in the urban environment in more places, and making sure that they are central to cities. To support the growing urban populations around the world. So it is part of the GSPC and should really stimulate this aspect going forward.
Thank you very much. I thank everyone for coming here, press and others, and I would like to thank the Missouri Botanical Garden again, and the St. Louis municipality, I think, for the declaration. That's a very, very big day for us, and an honor for us to be a part of it and see it. And I think today we will close the session now, and please everyone move on to the next session very quickly. You have 5 minutes only to get us started on our next meeting. Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you very much.